My mother-in-law told me, at our first Christmas dinner together, that her son had dated a woman before me who was much more suited to the family. She said it quietly, the way people say things they want you to hear but cannot be held accountable for. We were passing the potatoes. My husband Daniel was in the kitchen getting more wine. His sister was talking to someone across the table. It was just her voice and my ear and a bowl of mashed potatoes between us. "Lovely girl," she said. Her family had a beautiful home in Westchester. She really understood what this family is. Then she smiled and turned to the person on her other side. "My name is Stephanie, and what happened over the next 5 years is the story of how I learned that some people choose you as a target not because of who you are, but because of what your presence represents. A door that closed on something they wanted. A choice their child made that they did not approve of. A life that did not match the one they had designed in their heads. And how, when the moment finally came, I did not need to say a single word." Daniel and I met at 27. I was a middle school science teacher in New Jersey. He was a software engineer at a company in Manhattan. We met at a friend's birthday party, talked for 4 hours without noticing the time, and exchanged numbers at midnight. He called the next day. We went to dinner the following Thursday. By the second month, I knew. He is, and I say this having now known him for 8 years, one of the genuinely good ones. Patient, funny in a way that sneaks up on you, extraordinarily loyal to the people he loves. He calls his mother every Sunday without being asked. He is the kind of man who notices when you are tired before you say so, and quietly handles whatever needs handling without making a production of it. His mother's name is Barbara. She is 66 years old and lives in a large house in Connecticut that she has spent 30 years arranging to reflect a very specific vision of how a family should look. She has opinions about everything. What constitutes a proper hostess gift, which neighborhoods in which cities are acceptable, what a woman should do with her time and education and ambition. She had, before I arrived on the scene, a very clear sense of who Daniel would eventually bring home. I was not that person. I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Queens. My father drove a delivery truck for 23 years. My mother worked as a home health aide. We did not summer anywhere. We did not have a family home. We had a kitchen table where my parents helped me with homework every night, and a mother who came to every school play and every parent-teacher conference and every cross-country meet, and a father who told me every single day that I was capable of anything I decided to be capable of. I grew up knowing I was loved. I did not grow up knowing I was the right kind of person. Barbara knew this about me within approximately 4 minutes of our first meeting. I am not sure how. People like Barbara have a finely calibrated instrument for social placement. They assess a person's origins the way a geologist assesses rock composition, quickly and with confidence. By the end of that first dinner, she knew everything she needed to know about what I was not. What followed, for 5 years, was a sustained campaign of diminishment so well constructed that I sometimes questioned whether I was imagining it. The methods were always plausibly deniable. A comment about my apartment, said with concern, in a tone of gentle worry, that contained within it the clear implication that a woman of 30 should be able to afford something better. An inquiry about my teaching position that ended with a mention of Daniel's ex-girlfriend, who had been a corporate attorney. A remark at Thanksgiving, in front of 8 people, that she had always hoped Daniel would end up with someone who shared his interest in travel, said while looking directly at me because I had mentioned once that I didn't have a passport. I got a passport. She did not mention travel again after that. She found other territory. At our engagement party, she made a toast. It was 3 minutes long. She spoke about Daniel for 2.5 of those minutes, his accomplishments, his character, the qualities she was proud of. She spoke about me for 30 seconds. She said I was clearly very dedicated to my students and that she hoped I would be equally dedicated to her son. The room was warm and full of people who loved us. Daniel squeezed my hand under the table. Later, in the car, he said, "I'm sorry about that." I said, "It's okay." It was not okay, but I didn't know yet what to do with that. We got married in September. The wedding was, in the way that things are when two families with very different ideas about how things should be done attempt to plan an event together, a negotiation. Barbara had opinions about venues and caterers and invitation fonts and the specific shade of white that was appropriate for a wedding dress. I had opinions about what I wanted my wedding day to feel like. These did not always align. My mother, who had never planned a wedding and had no opinions about invitation fonts and whose primary concern was that I was happy, sat across from Barbara at the planning meetings and smiled with the particular grace of a woman who has spent 20 years helping people in difficult circumstances and has therefore developed an extraordinary capacity for patience. Barbara called my mother "so sweet" in the voice people use for things they do not take seriously. My mother helped me hem my dress the night before the wedding. We sat on the floor of my childhood bedroom with pins in our mouths, and she said, "You know what you are? You're exactly right. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I thought about those words a lot over the 5 years that followed. The pattern of the marriage was this. Daniel and I were happy. We were genuinely, substantively happy, the kind of happy that is built from daily life and not from performance. We bought an apartment in Brooklyn. I was promoted to department head at my school. He was promoted twice at his company. We got a dog named Fig. We cooked dinner together on weeknights and went to farmers markets on Saturday mornings and argued about whether the thermostat should be at 67 or 69 degrees and resolved it, as we resolved most things, by laughing about it eventually. Barbara came for holiday visits and long weekends and called every Sunday when Daniel called her. She was present in our life the way a particular kind of weather is present. Not always a storm, but always a pressure system. You could feel her in a room she was not in. The comments continued. They evolved. As my career progressed and became less easy to dismiss, she shifted terrain. She began talking about children. When were we planning to start a family? Wasn't I worried about waiting too long? Did I understand what it would mean for my career, but also did I understand that some sacrifices were worth making? Said always with concern, said always in the voice of a woman who only wants what is best. I want to be honest about what those 5 years cost. I think about this sometimes and I try to be accurate rather than dramatic. They cost me, in specific and traceable ways, a version of ease in my own marriage that I should have had from the beginning. Every holiday was a calculation. What to say, what not to say, how to sit in a room with a woman who had decided I was insufficient and had never revised that decision. It made me, in the years before I understood what was happening and learned to name it, smaller in ways I am still occasionally discovering. I did not tell Daniel the full extent of it. This was a mistake, and I know it was a mistake. I told him some. The toast, the comments, the 30 seconds at the engagement party. And he spoke to her, twice, and she cried both times, and Daniel came back to me afterwards looking like a man who had been asked to walk across a floor he knew had weak boards. I stopped telling him the things that were hard to prove. What I did instead was get very good at my job. I say this not as a non sequitur. I say it because I think it is part of the story. When someone systematically tells you that you are not enough, you have two choices. You can believe them, or you can build evidence to the contrary. I built evidence. I became an extraordinary teacher. I developed a curriculum for middle school science that 2 districts in New Jersey adopted. I wrote a paper about science education methodology that was published in a journal. I won a teaching award, a real one, given by the state, with a ceremony in Trenton that I attended with Daniel and my parents and my best friend Maya, all of us dressed up and proud, and Barbara, who did not come because she had a prior commitment. I noticed the prior commitment. I did not say anything about it. What I did say when Daniel apologized was, "It's okay. The people who matter were there." He knew what I meant. He did not push it. We were getting better by then at the particular navigation of that territory. What to say, what to leave in silence, how to protect the thing between us from the pressure system that existed around it. Year 5 was the year everything changed. It began in March. Daniel's company was acquired. Not a hostile acquisition, a strategic one, the kind where the acquiring company wanted the technology and the team and paid well for both. Daniel's stock vested. I do not want to be crass about numbers, and I will not be, but I will tell you that the number was significant, life-changing, in the specific sense that it changed the practical parameters of our life. We sat at our kitchen table the night it was confirmed, and Daniel said, "What do you want?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I mean, what do you want? We can do almost anything. What do you want?" I thought about it. "I want to keep teaching," I said, "and I want a house with a garden, and I want to go to Italy." He said, "Okay, all 3. We found a house in Brooklyn with a small garden in April. We closed in June. We planted tomatoes and basil and a rose bush that has, as of this writing, produced 47 roses in 2 years. We went to Italy in August. Florence, Rome, the Amalfi Coast. I used my passport, the one I had gotten after the first Thanksgiving comment, and I stood on a terrace above the Mediterranean and looked at the water and felt, in a way I cannot fully articulate, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Barbara came for a visit in September. This was her first visit to the new house. She arrived with a hostess gift, expensive, chosen with care, the kind of object that communicates both generosity and taste. And I showed her the house, room by room. She was quiet throughout the tour in a way that was different from her usual quiet. Her usual quiet was a tool. This quiet was something else. When we reached the garden, she stopped. The tomatoes were coming in. The roses were blooming for what I had been told would be the last time that season. Fig the dog was lying in the sun in the particular way dogs lie in the sun when everything is exactly right with their world. Barbara stood in the garden for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, and not in the voice she usually used for things meant to land somewhere specific, "This is beautiful." I said, "Thank you. I did most of the planting myself." She looked at the roses. "My mother had roses," she said. I did not know this about her. I had known her for 5 years, and I did not know her mother had roses. This is one of the things about people who exist in your life primarily as a pressure system. You know the weather they make, but not the history that shaped them. I said, "What kind?" She said, "Climbing roses, red ones, on a trellis on the side of the house." She paused. She died when I was 19. The house was sold a few years later. I always thought about those roses. I stood in my garden with my mother-in-law, and I thought about 19 years old, and a mother dying, and a house being sold, and climbing red roses on a trellis that no longer existed. I did not say anything for a moment. Then I said, "Come back in June. Mine will be at their best in June. I'll make sure there's a red one." She looked at me. I do not know what she expected me to say. I do not know what she expected anything to be by that point in the visit. But whatever she expected, It was not that. She said, "I'd like that." Dinner that evening was different. Not transformed. I want to be accurate, not sentimental. Barbara did not become a different person over a garden and a reference to dead roses. But something had shifted in the quality of the pressure system, like a front had moved through. At dinner, she asked about my curriculum, the one that had been adopted by 2 districts. She asked specific questions. She listened to the answers. After dinner, she helped me wash the dishes. We stood at the sink together and she said, very quietly, without looking at me, "Daniel chose well." I kept washing the dish I was washing. I did not make a thing of it. I said, "I think so too." She went home the next morning. That was 8 months ago. I will not tell you that everything has been easy since then. She is still Barbara. She still has opinions about invitation fonts and the right neighborhoods and what a woman should do with her time. She still occasionally says things that land with a particular weight. But she came back in June. I had a red rose ready. We stood in the garden and I cut it for her, and she held it in a way that told me something I had not known I was waiting to understand. She was not and had never been only the woman who told me I was insufficient. She was also a 19-year-old who lost her mother and a house with climbing roses and built over 40 years a very specific idea of how things should be, partly because that was her nature, and partly because if you hold tightly enough to the things you choose, maybe you can keep them. I do not excuse what those 5 years cost. I am not that generous, and I am not sure generosity is what is owed. But I understand it now, in a way I could not have understood it before I stood in a garden with a woman holding a rose and saw, briefly, the shape of the grief she had been carrying. Understanding someone is not the same as forgiving them. I have learned to hold both. My mother came to see the house last spring. She walked through every room and touched the door frames the way she touches things she is proud of. In the garden, she looked at the roses for a long time. She said, "Your grandmother would have loved this." I said, "I know." She held my face in her hands for a moment. My mother, who hemmed my dress on the floor of my childhood bedroom and told me I was exactly right. And she said, "Look what you built." I looked at the garden. I thought about the 5 years. I thought about the word insufficient and what I had done with it. "Yeah," I said. "Look what I built." If you are somewhere in the middle of your own 5 years, if there is a person in your life who has decided, for their own reasons, that you do not belong in the room you have chosen to be in, I want you to hear this. Build your garden. Not for them, not to prove anything. Because the things you grow from the right reasons outlast every comment ever made at a dinner table. You are exactly right. There is something I want to tell you about the years between the engagement party and the garden. The years when I was building evidence and not yet understanding why. I had a colleague at school named Patricia who had been teaching for 22 years and who had, in that time, developed the particular clarity of someone who has seen enough of people to stop being surprised by them. We ate lunch together on Tuesdays in the faculty room, and she knew, from the way I sometimes went quiet after long weekends, that something was happening in the edges of my life. One Tuesday in year 3, she said, "You want to tell me about it?" I told her. Not everything, just the shape of it. A mother-in-law who had decided I was not right. The comments, the weight of being assessed and found wanting repeatedly by someone whose opinion my husband cared about. Patricia listened without interrupting, which is rarer than it sounds. When I was done, she said, "How does your husband treat you?" I said, "Extraordinarily well." She said, "Then you have what you need. The other thing is weather. You can't control weather, You can only make sure your house is solid. I thought about that for a long time. I went home that evening and looked at my apartment, the one Barbara had made the comment about, and I thought, this is a good apartment. We are happy here. The house is solid. I called my mother. She answered on the second ring, the way she always does. I said, "Mom, am I enough?" There was a pause. Not because she was thinking about the answer. I could tell she was surprised I had asked. Then she said, "Stephanie, you have always been more than enough. What's happening?" I told her, the short version. My mother, who has held other people's hardest days for 20 years as a home health aide, has a very quiet way of receiving difficult things. She does not rush to fix or reassure. She listens first. When I finished, she said, "That woman is afraid of something." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "People don't work that hard to make someone feel small unless something in them is frightened. I don't know what she's frightened of, but it's hers to carry, not yours." I thought about that for a long time, too. It did not immediately fix anything. Understanding the source of a problem does not make the problem stop. But it changed the angle from which I held it. Barbara was no longer just a force that operated on me. She was a person who was afraid of something and had chosen me as the object onto which that fear was directed. That was her failing. It was not my insufficiency. The distinction sounds small. It was not small. In year 4, I started seeing a therapist. Her name was Dr. Anand, and she was calm and precise and had a very specific way of asking questions that made you hear what you were saying differently. In our 3rd session, she asked me to describe what happened in my body when I received one of Barbara's comments. I described it. She said, "And what do you do with that?" I said, "I keep my face even. I change the subject." She said, "And then?" I said, "I go home and I teach better the next day." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You transform it." I had not thought of it that way. "Into what?" I said. "Into something useful," she said. "You take something painful and you make it fuel. That's an extraordinary skill. It's also, if you do it exclusively, exhausting. At some point, you also need to put it down." I am still working on putting it down. That is the honest answer. The garden helps. Watching things grow that I planted, the tomatoes, the basil, the roses, helps in a way I did not anticipate when I started. There is something about growing things that is the opposite of diminishment. It is evidence of agency. I put a seed in the ground and something came from it that was not there before. Barbara's comments cannot reach the roses. Daniel knows more now than he knew in the first years. We have become, over 8 years, better at the particular courage of telling each other the true things. He sat with me last winter on a Sunday evening and asked me to tell him what those 5 years had actually been like. I told him. He listened the way he always listens, completely, without filling the pauses. When I finished, he said, "I should have seen more. I'm sorry I didn't." I said, "You saw what you could see. It was designed not to be visible." Still. "We're here," I said. "The house is solid. That's what matters." He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across the table and held my hand and said, "You are the most capable person I have ever known. Not the prettiest, not the most suited to the family, the most capable." I cried. Not the quiet kind, the other kind, the kind that surprises you with how much is in it. He handed me a dish towel, which made me laugh, and I cried and laughed at the same time in the kitchen, with the lights on and the dog at my feet, and the garden outside in the dark. My father called me last month. He does not call often. He is a man who expresses love primarily through presence, who has shown up to every important thing in my life without being asked. But he called to tell me he had read about the curriculum award in a local newsletter that covered New Jersey education. He said, "I showed everyone at the depot." I said, "Dad." He said, "I show everyone everything. I have a folder." He has a folder. My father, who drove a delivery truck for 23 years, has a folder of my professional accomplishments that he shows to his colleagues at the depot. I thought about Barbara. I thought about what she saw in my background and what she decided it meant. I thought about my father and his folder. Some people look at where you came from and see a ceiling. Some people look at where you came from and keep a folder. I know which kind of love builds a person. The house in Brooklyn has a garden. The garden has roses, a red climbing one now that I added specifically, that I trained along a small trellis on the south wall. In June, it will be full. Barbara is coming for the weekend. I do not know what those visits will look like long term. I do not know if Barbara will continue to move in the direction of the garden moment, or if the pressure system will rebuild itself. I am not counting on transformation. I am holding the possibility of it, carefully, the way you hold something that might be fragile. What I know is this: my house is solid. My marriage is solid. My garden is growing. My father has a folder. And I am, as my mother told me on the floor of my childhood bedroom, with pins in our mouths and a dress in our hands. Exactly right. Subscribe, because every story on this channel is real, it is raw, and it is worth your time. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are watching from. I read every single one.